Thank you so much, Paul, for that presentation. That was really good. And I think it also kind of validates what I'm going to speak about because yes, as you said, I mean, do have concerns here in Kenya around the economy. But weirdly enough, I think we have quite a resilient economy. And I do believe that is partially driven by, as you say, the optimism that people have, regardless of whatever they're facing on a day-to-day basis. We've seen the last 2 years, and especially around the youth, definitely because of the difficulties that they're facing. We have a lot of our youth going through the education system, getting good grades, but they can't get jobs, and the opportunities are not there. And what the government is then telling them is that, you don't have to look for opportunities here necessarily. We're providing you with options and opportunities for you to be able to go out there and look for work out there. But I don't think that that is necessarily enough. But I think this year we haven't seen a wave of protests, though it's still early on. We normally do see that coming up midway through the year. So let's see whether that's going to happen. So as you said, the economy, regardless of what's happening geopolitically all over the world, or in other markets, it still remains resilient. And in terms of the main economic drivers, we're looking at services, digital innovation, as you spoke to it. I do believe we are a very trend forward market, in the sense of, so for example, some of the stats that have come out in terms of things like TikTok usage, with the some of the highest users of platforms like TikTok around the world. Some of the earliest adopters in terms of mobile money, some of the innovations around fintech and all of those things. So we're very trend forward people from a cultural perspective. And I do believe that that is intrinsically driven by the need and the desire for progress as a people. So this will continue to drive us, though we do know that there's only so many steps forward you can take. And if your government and the governance is not aligned to that progressiveness, that takes you steps back. And so that's the main concern for most people. Do we have the right government, the right systems, the right structures to help us to be able to continue moving forward? We remain a regional hub for East Africa. Tanzania has tried to become that, but that hasn't really worked out. So I do believe that even for the foreseeable future, Kenya will remain a regional hub for the East African market. Some of the things, as you said, when we're talking about structures and economy, the rising cost of living, and then this goes back to what you're talking about in terms of making sure that, whatever brand or whatever product you have out there has the right value perception, underscored definitely by, the quality that it drives with consumers. So that is a big concern and it's, as you said rightly, it's shaping consumer spending behavior. We've seen some of our, clients having to innovate on product. The smaller SKUs. Again, our market is mainly driven through, general trade vis-a-vis modern trade. So making sure the smaller SKUs, the more affordable options are available to consumers. But also at the same time, I think it's a very interesting market in the sense of, for essentials, definitely the value perception has to continue being there. However, there is also a growing demand for luxury brands, right? 5, 6, 8 years ago, when you're driving around in Nairobi, there's certain luxury brands that you wouldn't be seeing, but now they've become more prevalent. You're seeing the Lamborghinis on the roads. You're seeing the high end cars on the road. Also in terms of the buildings, the houses people are building, the things, luxury brands opening up even in Nairobi. So it goes both ways, and I think it's driven by the need for, status and aspiration, in as much as also there's the, lower end of the market, which is looking for better prices and being able to manage their budgets within what they actually can afford. And then, of course, I think, and this is important, the rise of digital adoption. It is continuing to accelerate in the market. Spoke to, mobile first commerce, and this is really driving also, online commerce, social commerce, e-commerce, all of that. And then those are just from a larger scale of things. And then when you look at it from a micro level, I think we've already spoken to us being value driven, and ensuring and prioritizing affordability, underscored by quality, utility, and authenticity from brands, right? And I think authenticity comes in different aspects. It's not only in terms of, the product, and the utility that it provides. It's also from the way that a brand speaks to its consumers. And I think for this, I would say that, yes, as you've seen in terms of trends, some of the things that with digital adoptions, with social media, even in terms of how we perceive and how we consume, different information is different. The reason why I would say for most of us, we've moved from consuming regular mainstream news is not even just because it's long in its own format, but it's also quite factual. And I think we are seeing more of a trend of it being people wanting more in terms of opinion and trusting, certain creators or certain platforms being seen as being more authentic, because it's not just about something being factual. It's also about it providing an opinion and almost like a way to analyze and criticize, from a way that people can actually be able to know what it means for them, right? Trust and reputation matter in our own environment. However, I think in terms of trust and reputation, I think you have to break it down a bit more, and into the nuances of like, what that means to people. Because I actually feel like trust and reputation is also very subjective at this point in time, honestly. And I do think that's a sad state of affairs, because I mean, truth should be truth, fact should be fact, but I don't think it is in a sense seen that way at this point in time. In terms of what drives the economy as well is the informal sector, and that continues. Again, as we said, formal employment and the opportunities that are there, and especially for the youth, are quite few. And so the youth are innovating in their own way in terms of, services and products that they can provide. And I do think, in a sense, that is not a very bad thing, because what you see is very interesting, services coming up. Like, for example, there's I'm trying to think of some of the most innovative things that I've seen the youth coming up with. Um, you know, very differentiated brands in terms of clothing, very differentiated formats in terms of content creation, very interesting formats in terms of, art, so many sectors, right? And I do think in the long term that would benefit our economy in terms of diversification. Because one of the things that has been there for a long time is, as we say, Kenyans are very trend forward people. So whenever you have a certain trend or something that is happening in the economy, or people see that this is something that is viable economically, is that everybody just wants to jump into that bandwagon. But if you have more people trying to innovate and differentiate services, then that diversification is actually good for the economy in the long term, right? Okay. And then in terms of just looking at it from a media landscape and how this has evolved, and I know we've spoken to a lot of things, and these are just stats, just taken from different places. is that about 48% of Kenyans have of Kenyans are online. Though this does honestly shift from different reports, but for this specific case, we're choosing to use with the data portal reportal stats. In terms of cellular, that's oversubscribed as it is in many other African countries where we have multiple SIM cards and multiple networks per person. And then social media, as you said, is big, and people are spending quite a bit of time on online. I think maybe about 4 hours online and on social per day, so which is quite high. Digital platforms are definitely helping to transform media house models. And of course, this is driven by the fact that, circulation numbers for, physical papers is going down, but also just packaging information and content in a way that is easy for consumers to consume. And then, we have, the blogs, the YouTube pages, as we say, the ones that are now becoming a lot more popular in terms of where people are getting their information first. And when we talk about in terms of, where these conversations are happening, as we said, online, on social media platforms, you have TikTok lives, you have X Spaces being on the rise, and we will see a lot more of those happening. So we do have our general election next year. And what you find is when we have an election, you have, everything political. That's what will be driving a lot of the conversations online and will be trending online for the next foreseeable future. In terms of also how that then impacts how brands communicate, and also in terms of the timing of that is really important to ensure that you're tracking and seeing where sentiment is at any point in time. So like, for example, we have the election coming up in August 2027, right? So for this year, what brands are trying to do is, and we've seen this within this quarter, is we're doing the most. If you have any, product launches, any services launches before, the conversation and before the landscapes becomes murky, do all of that this year. Next year, everything will be controlled around the political conversation, unfortunately. So it does not give you the space and the timing to be able to really communicate as effectively and as efficiently as you would in any other time in place, right? And then in terms of and we've spoken about, the digital shift and how that's controlling conversation, and how this is now the trusted authority in terms of news and in terms of what people want to see and how people want things to go. However, traditional media, I think, still remains very important, though we have seen quite a decline, and especially in terms of, print platforms or in terms of TV viewership. However, radio as well, I think, for the more national platforms, but then something like radio still remains very important to people, and especially the vernacular stations. There's still quite a bit of affinity around that. Let me see. I wanted to see if there's anything I really wanted to point out. So I think around print, the main thing I would say is, yes, it's on the decline. Most of these publications are going online. Some of them are free, some of them are under subscription. However, I don't really think that the subscription model is actually going well for a lot of these platforms. Radio, as you said, is the vernacular platforms are still very influential. And there's a high affinity, and especially in rural areas, but even you find in some of the urban areas, and especially around the cities outside of Nairobi, these radios are still very influential. The personalities are still influential in terms of driving not just conversation on air, but also off air. and also trends. Like for example, one of the stations, Radio Jumbo, has this show in the morning which is called Patanisha, where they sort of help people. Like if, for example, you are married and you separated, bringing people back together. So they drive conversations in and around outside of being on air, online, and all of those things. TV, still relevant, though I think it's changed significantly. We had a few dominating platforms led by Citizen TV, then you had your NTV and your or your NTV or your KTN. But now, with a lot more homes getting broadband, and a lot more people trusting social media to get their news, that has gone down. And even if you look at in terms of the advertising share of spend and how that is shifting, you can also see a lot more of the spends are now going into digital and social platforms. And a good example of this is like the Unilever announcement that where they were traditionally very TV heavy, now they're shifting most of their spend into social platforms. Okay. All right. And then this is just a slight look in terms of sentiment and where the conversations are leading to right now. And this is what we spoke around in terms of like right now, the political landscape is heating up with the elections coming up, and we expect that that will drive the conversation for the next almost 2 years, I would say, for the next 2 years, right? But even during regular periods outside of the election period, if you go onto X, if you go onto TikTok, you'll still find a lot of political conversations still going on in those spaces as well. And then another one, conversation that is really driving a lot of conversation is the geopolitical, what do you call it? The geopolitical landscape at this point with the Iran-US war, the fears around energy provision and the shortages that are expected. So that's also driving a lot of conversation. Again, because you said we're very trend forward people, the technological advancements, innovations, trends around AI are also quite popular when we're tracking sentiment. So, and then you also have, the negative sentiments fluctuating over time, and you can see the trends are also quite split between, locally what's happening and also globally what is happening in those spaces. Okay. And so I think that's it. In terms of key media highlights, please allow me not to talk through this because we've talked about it. But maybe something to point out is that, with all of these changing trends, our macros, our micros, continually shifting. Our media landscape is also shifting within those trends. I think the one thing that is underpins how to ensure that you have an effective brand strategy that works is to ensure that you have tracking and data is underpinning whatever it is that you're doing in terms of your communications, right? And in terms of sources as well, I do know, we have studies like the one that Paul walked you through. But then, you also, I feel like you almost have to have several sources of data just to make sure that you have sufficient to be able to say that, you're able to build not just, salience, but also brand equity across very different metrics, right? So we've always spoken about, I think, the data poverty that we have in many of our African markets. But I think the one important thing, the one good thing that is happening is that that's also changing in the sense that, you have whether it's your social listening. You have some online platforms that give you an understanding of everything that's happening within your market or within a global wider context. Then, you also have these kinds of consumer surveys. So just making sure that you're investing in data, I always say, is almost an investment, because then, in terms of the of probabilities, you are increasing your probability and your chances of actually succeeding. And so in terms of, I think what I'd like to underpin based on everything that I've spoken about, is that yes, in terms of engagement and how you're engaging with your consumers, a digital first engagement is really important. I do know most brands, most marketing managers have actually ensured that they're tracking this, and they're shifting appropriately according to the data and the research that they have into social platforms or influence or podcasts. But I think that it's still not very sufficient. I find most of the industries are still leaning very heavily towards traditional media. And I know traditional media is really great at driving salience, right? But in terms of driving meaning, driving difference, not so great as at that. So if you're trying to drive differentiation and meaningfulness, I think having a digital fast engagement with consumers is really important. And also that's a way to gauge in terms of perception. How are people perceiving your products? Are there any issues that you need to address, and also in terms of positioning, definitely. So you'll be able to tell if your positioning is landing or not. Yeah. And then community and cultural alignment. Um, and I think this is probably the point that I was trying to make when I was talking about radio, and that's why it's still very relevant, right? We still find things that are, localized to either our language or how we look or the way that we consume things to be a lot more authentic than, a generic messaging that is in a language that I do not consider my own, or a generic image that is, shot in somewhere else in the world and is being pushed to me as something genuine, right? And then in terms of data, this is what we talked about partially. So data-driven marketing is important, right? You need the data to ensure that you have the most highest probability of success. But also, apart from that, you also want to make sure that you are understanding, if I put in this much investment, how much am I actually be able to get out of it? And you can only be able to measure significantly and sufficiently the ROI if you have your metrics set in at the very beginning and you're able to track those over time, right? You have to have a starting point, basically. And then in terms of the most efficient and the best media strategies, the blend between the TV and the traditional media, and also the digital, but ensuring that even when you're blending your strategies, they're underpinned by data, right? So that you know where you need to work a little harder, where do you need to optimize a little more, right? And so for you to be able to win in this market, you have to be able to combine both cultural fluency, ensuring that you have and you understand the culture of the market. You have the data to back up in terms of what people are saying, what they're doing, what they actually need. You also need to have the digital agility. And let me also just maybe mention something around agility, because I think it's important, right? In our marketing strategies right now. I remember maybe 10 years ago, something that we used to do is we used to sit, not even 10, even 5 years ago, we used to sit down and we used to come up with annual plans, right? And your annual plan would be sufficient for you throughout the year. But that's no longer true because your trends, your landscapes are changing so fast that in as much as, yes, you have to sit down and strategize and have your priorities in order at the beginning of the year, you have to continuously track and understand what's happening on the ground, to be able to continually, change and effect strategies according to that. And especially when you're looking at things like content strategies, a content strategy can never be static. It is, a continuous learning process. It's a continuous improvement process. So agility is required, not just from a digital perspective, but just from an overall marketing perspective. And I think economic sensitivity, Paul spoke to that, and making sure that you're delivering, on value, but not just value, being meaningful in terms of it's fulfilling not just the functional, but also the personal, the emotional needs of consumers as well. And also just ensuring that you're present wherever conversations are actually happening for consumers. And that's it from me.